House of Silence by TheBeckster, Chapter 30. Padme Amidala looked so young in death. He had been a public figure for so long, most people had forgotten that he was only 27. Bail Organa had no novice when it came to state funerals. One didn't have a long career as a politician without attending his fair share. People died, young and old, good and bad. Even the rich, famous, and powerful were not immune to life's one inevitability. Oftentimes, when a politician died, attending the funeral was more about making a political statement to their constituents than mourning the dead. Bale had long ago perfected the art of donning the mourning colors of the deceased home planet and putting a somber enough expression on his face. Most funerals Bale attended were out of senatorial duty. He had been fortunate enough that a majority of the state funerals in his career had been for senators that had died after a couple decades of retirement, people he had never known personally, people who died peacefully in their sleep. There had been personal funerals throughout the years, thankfully few and far between. There were friends and colleagues in the Senate who had been taken too early by one cause or another, illness, poison, speed or accidents, an enraged Sith. Bale didn't have to put up an act for Padme's funeral. It was all he could do not to break down as he followed the funeral procession through the streets of Theed. The Naboo had turned up in droves to mourn their king, and multitudes of off-world mourners came as well. The city was packed and deathly silent. Bale never would have thought that such multitudes could produce such silent stillness. It felt to Bale that not a single soul wanted to breathe if their beloved King Amidala couldn't. Bale kept his eyes trained on the casket and his thoughts on Leia. He couldn't look at Padme's family. Offering his condolences had been hard enough when he had returned the body. His mother, Jobel, had collapsed across the casket. His father, Rui, had fallen silent and couldn't say a word. Padme's sister had been the one to demand to know what had happened and why her brother was dead. Bale, ignoring the sick guilt twisting in his stomach, dutifully handed over Padme's box of personal effects and told them the lie he and the Jedi had agreed upon. After the fall of the Jedi, Padme took it upon himself to go out looking for any Jedi that might have escaped the purge and bring them in for refuge. He refused to allow his security staff to accompany him, refusing to make them implicit in his treason. He and Bale were supposed to rendezvous, but Padme came across some separatists before they could meet. It was plausible enough to anyone who knew Padme, but Bale hated that he couldn't tell Padme's family about Leia. He couldn't tell them that Padme's daughter was safe and secure on the ship. He had to tell someone. Someone needed to know the truth, but when he tried to speak to Typho and some of Padme's devoted footmen, they refused to listen. They claimed that learning the fate of the children was too risky. Some of Padme's enemies would not be satisfied with just his death. Secrets they did not know couldn't be used to hurt the children. So Bale kept his eyes averted as Jobel wept and clung to her husband's arm while they marched through Theed. He didn't watch Rui's empty eyes never leave his son's face. He didn't look at the way Sola held her daughters close to her. The family needed comfort that Bale couldn't give. He couldn't risk Leia's safety. But with every step, his resolve weakened. So he kept his eyes locked on the casket, on his friend, and mentally vowed over and over again to protect Leia, to uphold Padme's values, and to end this empire and restore democracy into the galaxy. Bale would fight this darkness, giving his own life if he had to, because he knew that was exactly what Padme would have done. Once Padme had been interred, Bale left Naboo. It was sooner than could be considered polite, But Vale and Padme had been close personal friends. Nobody could truly blame him for not wishing to stick around after the funeral to watch other senators' public shows of grief. Besides, Vale had a daughter waiting on his ship, a baby who needed a family. The logistics had been easy enough to work out. The queen and her consort would have little trouble drawing up the appropriate documentation for adopting a child. With just a few details forged for the sake of Leia's safety, the Alderaanian throne would have its long-awaited heir. Bria was aware of the circumstances, aware of her new daughter's parentage and the dangers that could lead to. She had long wanted a child to call her own, though she would have never wished for this situation upon anyone. And while her heart was filled with grief for her friend, she felt nothing but a great upwelling of love when she held her daughter for the first time. She pulled a fold of the soft green blanket away from Leia's sleeping face, pressed a kiss on her forehead, and vowed to love her until her very last breath. Beads of sweat rolled down Obi-Wan's face as the suns of Tatooine beat down on him. They would be setting soon, and already they were dipping toward the horizon. But it was still unbearably hot. He had never been fond of desert planets, too hot, too dry, and they always seemed to have a hovering veil of death in their air. His Eopie stepped on the rock hidden beneath the sand. The beast stumbled and grunted, but kept its footing and continued its gentle, plodding pace. Still, the misstep jolted the riders. Obi-Wan's heart's rate spiked, and the infant in his arms whimpered. He was in pain, hungry, hot, and physically reeling from the loss of a bond that was as much a part of him as his own hand. Obi-Wan could do nothing to relieve any of Luke's discomforts, but he can't see the homestead on the horizon. Comfort was coming to the baby soon. Still, he tried his best to soothe the baby back to sleep while keeping him shaded beneath his robes. Obi-Wan knew that Luke would soon become accustomed to the hot suns and burning sands of Tatooine, probably faster than he would assimilate. But while he still could, he tried to protect Luke from the scorching rays, just for a little while longer. The sun dipped even lower, throwing light directly into Obi-Wan's eyes. By the time he reached the homestead, two figures stood near the house, silhouetted by the sunlight. The Eopie slowed to a stop and sank onto its knees. Grateful for the rest, one figure approached as Obi-Wan carefully slid off the creature's back. She was a young woman, with light blonde hair pulled up out of her face. Beru, Obi-Wan assumed from Anakin and Padme's descriptions. The other, Owen, sat back a ways, eyeing Obi-Wan wearily. He had told Anakin's stepbrother something of what happened before they left Paulus Massa. No doubt he had heard more from the HoloNet over the last couple days. Beru stopped short, offering Obi-Wan a tight smile and holding her arms out semi-expectantly. Obi-Wan finally uncovered Luke and placed him in Beru's arms. He was still wrapped up in his green blanket, the only piece of home that had been available to the infants. He knew Bail had taken Leia home with her own matching blanket. Luke fussed and squirmed at the sudden change of carrier, but Beru rocked him gently and smiled tenderly at him. "Poor thing," she murmured to him. "I know you've had a rough couple of days." Luke quieted some, and she looked up at Obi-Wan. "Please come in. Owen will get your Eopie some food and water while she rests." Obi-Wan shook his head, his exhaustion pressing down on him like the weights of an entire world. "I must set off before night falls." He didn't want to accept their hospitality and intrude in their home, or have to recount what happened to Anakin again. Still, at the very least, he owed Owen and Beru an explanation, more detailed than his original call to Owen had been. "She'll need water before you ride again," Beru pointed out. "Otherwise, you'll exhaust her before you get back to Anchorhead." Obi-Wan drew a tired breath, but conceded. There was no need to tell them he wasn't returning to the tiny town. His destination was still to the west, over the Jutland wastes. Owen had already moved to take care of the Opie. So Obi-Wan followed Beru down into the house. He sank gratefully into the offered chair around the dining room table and tried to stave off his need for sleep. The last 3 years of war had taught his body to sleep whenever the opportunity arose, and he was having difficulty fending off that training in the peace and quiet of the homestead. Beru disappeared for several minutes, and Obi-Wan had nearly drifted off without realizing it. Before she came back with a laden tray, she slid the tray onto the table, urging Obi-Wan to help himself before bustling off again. He eyed the offered sustenance, some dried fruit, some cheese, what looked like homemade pastries, and a pitcher full of deep red juice and 3 glasses. Suddenly, Obi-Wan felt parched and famished, and he realized how long it had been since he had a meal. He had eaten before he left Palace Massa, but he hadn't had much since arriving on Tatooine. His meal priorities had been for Luke, not himself. He couldn't go a day or 2 without much. The infant couldn't. He could go a day or 2 without much. The infant couldn't. Belatedly, he remembered the spare supplies he had for Luke. Not much, just some dry formula and diapers. But he wouldn't need it anymore. He had to be sure to leave it with Owen and Beru before he left. He poured himself a glass of juice and drank half of it in one gulp. It had a unique flavor, one he couldn't identify, but it thoroughly quenched his thirst. He picked up a pastry and nibbled at it while he waited. The food and drink helped him feel better, but only marginally so. By the time he finished the pastry and a piece of dried fruit, Beru had returned with Luke tucked into the crook of her arm while the baby drank quite contentedly from a bottle. She held the baby so gently but confidently. It almost looked like it came natural to her. Obi-Wan felt a sense of relief wash over him when a concern he hadn't even realized he had been holding on to was lifted. Luke would be well loved here, well taken care of. He had promised Padme that he would watch over his son. But he had very little concern now that Luke would need much watching for the first decade of his life. Finally, Owen joined them at the table. "You've got quite a lot of supplies for making the trip between here and Anchorhead," the farmer commented as he poured a drink. His tone was searching, but not accusatory. "You're not going back to town, are you?" No point in hiding the truth now. "No, I'll be moving on to the Jutland wastes." "Tonight?" Beru asked, anxiety rising in her voice. "That was my plan." Owen shared a grim look with his wife. "I would strongly recommend you wait until morning. The wastes aren't safe after dark. I can protect myself." "I'm sure you can, but you look dead on your feet, General Kenobi," Owen stated boldly. "Please, just call me Obi-Wan, or—" He cut off, remembering he had picked a name. "Ben, I suppose, would be more appropriate now. Either way, unless you're at your sharpest, the wastes will kill you. They're not to be traveled lightly." Owen warned before taking a drink. "They're filled with twisting labyrinths of rock. A wrong turn in the dark will send you to your death off a cliff. There are predators in the night. Many of them will happily make a meal of a man. And there are Tusken raiders. Over the past few years, they've only become more vicious." Obi-Wan nodded, pretending like he was aware of all those dangers. Anakin hadn't talked much of her home planet, but she never made it sound like an easy place to live. These dangers weren't unexpected, but perhaps it would be best to wait until morning. He was the outsider, and Owen had grown up on the outskirts of the Jutlands wastes. He knew the territory. Still, Obi-Wan didn't want to linger, and the Force would help guide him. "I should leave tonight. I will be alright on my own." Owen pressed his lips together, but didn't argue. "I can't make you stay, but you should at least let your Eopie get a chance to rest. She has a long journey ahead of her." Obi-Wan nodded, agreeing with Owen's sentiment. It had already been a long day for the creature, and a nighttime trek through the Jutland wastes was far going to be easy was not going to be easy on the poor beast. That seems fair. While we wait, Owen cleared his throat, uncomfortable, and reached for some food. Tell us what happened to Anakin. He popped some fruit into his mouth and chewed carefully before speaking again. His eyes never left the baby in his wife's arms. You said that he was hers? Obi-Wan nodded. Luke is Anakin's son. I don't know much about the Jedi, but I didn't think that having children was allowed. It's not. Obi-Wan closed his eyes and took a measured breath before delving into the story. He had intended to only tell the broad story and gloss over most of the details, but as he spoke, he found the words flowing easier and the details getting deeper. It almost felt relieving, like a release of long pent up pressure to tell the story to another soul who hadn't been involved. It took longer than he thought to tell the story. The sun's fully set. Owen had turned off the homestead's power, leaving them in the glow of the small portable lanterns. It was a precaution, the farmers explained, against the Tuscans finding their home in the dark. With no other with no others around, a light could be seen for miles. Finally, Obi-Wan reached at the end of the tale, trailing off after the death of Padme and his call to the farmers. Owen and Beru sat in shocked silence. Luke had long since fallen asleep in his aunt's arms. She did that? Beru asked weakly, her arms tightened reflectively around Luke. Anakin did all of that? Obi-Wan nodded silently in response. It wouldn't be her first massacre, Owen muttered, almost mostly to himself. What? The moisture farmer blinked at Obi-Wan, somewhat surprised. You didn't know? Didn't know what? Owen looked away from the Jedi before speaking. It's mostly rumors, really, but he took a deep breath. It was a few years ago, when her mother died. What what did she tell you about it? Nothing much. She didn't speak of it. Owen's lips pressed into a grim line, as if the rumors he had heard had just been confirmed by that one statement. The Sand people took Shmi one morning and held her captive for about a month. They tortured her, killed her slowly. Anakin went looking for her and found her. Whether Shmi was dead or alive when she did, I don't know, but after Anakin left, an entire camp of Tuscans was found killed. No, massacred in their camp. We can't be sure that it was Anakin's doing, but the bodies had strange wounds, not made by any weapon a rival tribe would have used. And the camp wasn't plundered or looted. There were just bodies everywhere, even children. Owen's words rang in Obi-Wan's ears. Anakin had slaughtered an entire tribe of people in rage, and he had never noticed that wound festering in her. How could he have called himself her mentor and brother and friend when there was so much about Anakin he had never known? A heavy silence fell between them, and all three found their eyes drawn to Luke. The baby slept soundly, gripping his blanket in one fist. He's going to ask, Beru said quietly, sounding a little heartbroken. He's going to ask about his parents. What are we supposed to tell him? Whatever you see fit. Luke is your child to raise. I will be around if you need me, but I think it would be best if I kept my distance for a while. And is he a Jedi? Owen asked hesitantly. Obi-Wan hated the words he had to say next. They hurt. The Jedi are no more. But is he like Anakin? Yes, Obi-Wan nodded. He is strong with the Force. But out here, so far away from everything, it would be nearly impossible for him to be found. But if he's like Anakin, if he uses his powers, won't people take notice? Obi-Wan closed his eyes, again hating the words he had to say. He had already told them once to Organa, but they felt so wrong. He's so young, he doesn't yet have the concept of the Force. But even infants will begin to realize they have some control. Small things like lifting toys. If you discourage him when the behavior starts, his abilities will go dormant. If he is unaware of them, he would become nearly indistinguishable from any other child. Beru and Owen nodded solemnly. Obi-Wan stood up. The hour was later than he had planned, and he needed to leave. I must go now. Owen frowned, but made no other comment about the dangers of the Judlin wastes. Yoriopi is in the barn. She should be rested by now. Obi-Wan didn't wait for either of the farmers to escort him, and he made no move to follow when he walked away. Owen was right. The Eope was rested. In fact, the beast was deeply asleep. Curled up on a small bed of hay, exhaustion settled into every fiber of Obi-Wan's being, and he couldn't bring himself to wake the animal. He lowered himself to the floor and leaned against the sleeping creature. The steady, rhythmic rise and fall of her breath reminded Obi-Wan of the tides of the Force. How peaceful it used to feel when it would lull him to sleep. There was no peace in the Force now. There wouldn't be until new generations were born, restoring balance and replacing those lost. There was still hope for the damage to be repaired, but it would take time. Obi-Wan slept fitfully. The Eope shifted occasionally in her sleep, jolting him awake, and he was plagued by nightmares and flashbacks. He started awake just before dawn, and the ghost of a woman still standing before him. But she faded as consciousness returned. He didn't know her, but she was furious with him in his last dream. Why, he couldn't remember, but Obi-Wan was certain he deserved her wrath. The Eope was awake and nudging him gently with her snout. Obi-Wan stood up, popping his stiff joints, and began silencing the animal. The farmers had yet to awaken, and he could still make a quiet getaway in the waning darkness. Dawn would be breaking soon, and he needed to be far away from this place, far away from everything. The doors to the bridge of the Star Destroyer whisked open, and all personnel immediately averted their eyes from the black boots strode across the deck. Out of respect for some, yes, but fear was the reigning factor. It couldn't be helped. Even after several weeks stationed on the destroyer, they had yet to adjust to Vader. He carried an aura around him that sunk into the very bones of those unfortunate enough to share a room. Even the officers didn't fare well for very long in Vader's presence. Their ranks did not protect them. Vader had already killed one lieutenant, and the reason was still unclear. He exuded a toxic miasma of anger, pain, and fear, and it steered the most primal cortexes of a man's brain. You do not acknowledge the predator unless you want it to attack. Furtive glances and hushed conversations over hands of Sabak pieced together a picture of Emperor's newest attack dog. Black from head to toe, heavy boots and footfalls that seemed more solid than mere flesh and bone. A stiff, towering figure, heavy armor, and a chest plate thick with apparatus. A menacing mask that hissed with every breath and hid most of his face. The slowly healing scar tissue that gnarled the right side of his face into a permanent scowl, the yellow eyes sickly and venomous. No, a few interjected. His eyes were blue, colder than ice and harder than Durasteel. The deep black hood, an unmoving shroud, the glare that seemed to steal the very breath of a man's lungs, the weapon at his hip, a corrupted relic, and when he spoke, that voice was enough to give even the battle-hardened veterans chills. Many weren't sure Vader was fully human. If he was human at all, the officers scoffed at such insinuations and reprimanded the gossiping enlisted men. Of course Vader was human. The Emperor would not taint the purity of this grand empire by employing his trust with anything else, with anything less. Their assurances hardly put anyone at ease. Sometimes after a touch too much of contraband liquor or closet brewed hooch, some of the enlisted would get a spooked look in their eyes, with more than a touch of shame. They'd recount a story from their youth. Demons and beasts, ghouls and creatures would be resurrected from childhood nightmares, and all fell into the shape of Vader. The core worlders laughed at the backwater superstitions of the mid and outer rimmers, but inside they wished they had such ways to describe Vader. Vader might not be a nightmare demon come to steal your soul, but he very well may be a monster. He had seemingly appeared from nowhere after the fall of the Republic, with a vitriolic hatred for the Jedi and a lust for their blood. Only a monster could receive the Emperor's blessing from nothing. Only a monster would choose to have an entire legion of clones act as their enforcers. Only a monster would have an open preference for those things over loyal humans. Only a monster would command with such an unyielding iron hand. Only a monster could thrive on bloodshed alone. Command clearly didn't have an issue employing such a being. After all, when you are exterminating legends and gods from the galaxy, a monster is exactly what you call forth. End of story.